Today I'm going to talk about the incoherence of subjective morality. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Now, when I say subjective morality, just to quickly define terms because there's a lot of murkiness out there, what I mean is anything that basically amounts to holding that whether something is good or evil is dependent upon what a person believes to be the case, not and that there is not an objective standard to which the individual's opinion simply is obligated to conform and is right insofar as it does conform to that objective standard and is wrong insofar as it does not conform to that objective standard. I need to distinguish real quickly a few things that objective standard is not and what this doesn't mean, because there's a few things people get really, really wrong and I think go sort of off the rails because of it and get lost because they don't understand the terminology. The big thing being that they don't understand the distinction between good and evil and culpable and not culpable. So culpability is where a person is responsible, where a person does something that is good or evil, is what the thing is. So like if you give somebody food when they're hungry, this is good. When you murder somebody, this is evil. There's another thing that comes up because there's a distinction to be made between natural good and moral good. Natural goods are things like beauty and health and strength and wealth and intelligence and so on. These are all the things where, like, essentially is the natural thing able to do its natural function. Moral good versus moral evil is how are you using the thing. So a natural good might be being strong, and moral good might be using that strength to lift up the weak, and moral evil might be using that strength to crush people and impose your will upon them by force for not, for your own selfish ends. So that's the distinction between natural goods and moral goods. Culpability is not about the thing that's done, but whether the person actually intended to do good or intended to do evil in the thing. Culpability is, so there are two main reasons why a person would not be culpable for doing evil. So the two main reasons would be either they're mistaken about what the objective standard is, or they can be mistaken as to a matter of fact. To be mistaken as to what the objective standard is, suppose you were brought up to believe that revenge is a duty, so that even if you wish to be merciful, it would be morally reprehensible to be merciful, and that you must instead take revenge, because that is what is good. Well, in this circumstance, if somebody does something to you that you want to forgive, in not forgiving them, but in taking revenge, even though you are subjugating your own impulses to conform as best you can to what you understand to be the objective moral standard, what's going on is that you are really truly attempting to be good. You are attempting to conform yourself. You are not trying to be selfish. You are not trying to have things your own way. You are, in fact, trying to submit yourself to that which is beyond you and better than you and correct. You just happen to be utterly incorrect about what that is. The importance here is that technically can happen before death, but much more importantly, after death, when you come to face truth face to face and come to know what actually is good, you then do not have an attachment to this evil that you committed because you didn't even want to. It wasn't something that meant something to you. You were simply trying to do what is right. So in seeing what is truly right, you have the freedom from that evil to turn away from it and towards the good, to accept the good and to become one with it. You have the ability to repent of your evil. The other way you cannot be morally culpable for evil is, broadly speaking, is mistake of fact. So a really simple example. Suppose somebody is thirsty and you pour them a glass of water and give it to them. And then they drink from this, and then their health is restored because, you need water to live. Or health is maintained. Not necessarily restored, but in any event. Same basic concept. You improve their health by giving them something that is needed for them to be healthy, in this case, a glass of water. But suppose it turns out that that glass of water was actually a glass of sulfuric acid. It's also a clear, I believe, odorless liquid. And so they die horribly from this. Well, you were not attached to the evil that you did, even though because of giving them this thing, you killed them, because you were not trying to do that. To the best of your knowledge, you thought that what you were doing was handing them a glass of healthy water, and in fact, you handed them a glass of sulfuric acid. I'm taking this, by the way, I don't know whether or not this would actually work. I'm taking this from the joke, I can't remember how it goes exactly. Something like Andrew was a chemist, but Andrew is no more. For what he thought was H2O was H2SO4. The H2O being water and H2SO4 being sulfuric acid. Anyway, point being, this is a mistake as to fact, and it has the same thing as a mistake as to the correct moral order, in that it reduces culpability, or can even get rid of culpability, depending upon how reasonable it was for you to think that the thing that you were doing was different than what it actually was. Because again, you have no attachment whatever to the evil. You entirely desired to do something else. You desired to do what was good. You were trying to do what was good to the best of your knowledge, and you just happened to be mistaken as to fact. Again, especially on the other side of death, when you come to know what is actually good, it can apply before death too. But when you come to know the truth face to face and all is made clear and there is no longer the possibility of error, you will have no attachment to any of the evil that you did under the mistake that you were doing something other than what you were in fact doing. And so you will again be able to repent of your evil and turn to good. That's culpability. That is where the subjective state of the person matters tremendously, because whether or not they are culpable for the evil that they did depends upon their knowledge of, whether or not they knew what they were doing was wrong, and also whether or not they did it on purpose. The former gets to the full consent of the will. The full consent of the will gets to the latter, but the knowledge that the thing is actually wrong gets to the mistakes as to what is the proper moral order. Now, being wrong is not a get-out-of-jail-free card, and it's also got problems associated with it. I'm not here teaching a full-on lecture, on the nature of morality. So when I say these things reduce culpability, I don't mean that it's just fine and people are fine, perfectly fine being ignorant either of the moral law or of the nature of fact. By the way, less extreme example, but something that really comes up is take doctors, right? Let's say you believe that a medication is helpful for something, and it turns out later on that the clinical trials had gotten their results by accident. Happens it's unusual, but can happen. They weren't conducted quite right. Turns out their beneficial effect basically doesn't really exist. Turns out the side effects are worse in the general population than they were in the clinical trial. And basically, by prescribing this medication, you weren't doing anyone any good, and you were hurting people. Well, that sucks, and that's awful. It does happen from time to time, not super commonly, but it does happen. And that is a really good example of where the person is not culpable for what he did because he was relying on the best of his knowledge. And he really did go, reading the journal articles, looking over, trusting the people who do a fairly good job of running these clinical trials and making sure that possible sources of error really are weeded out and so on. But they're human, they make mistakes, they do things wrong. Humans make so many mistakes, and they're so very, very fallible. Anyway, so that's an example of where a person would have very, very little culpability because they really worked hard to try to be correct about a matter of fact, but it didn't work. Their best efforts failed at being correct. So, in contrast, there's a person who, kind of glanced and saw, yeah, it looks about right, grabbed something, and then they were wrong. Where they put far too little effort into it, their culpability is reduced but by no means eliminated because they really should have put more work into it, and had they put more work into it, they would have been correct as to a matter of fact. So when I talk about this, I don't mean that this is a get-out-of-jail-free card or anything. Okay, but this is where, and some people talk about subjective morality. What they really mean is culpability does depend entirely on the state of the subject rather than the state of the object. The thing that they're acting upon, that it's what they knew and what they were trying to do really determines culpability. This is one reason why we approximate culpability within things like criminal justice systems and even interpersonal relationships. When somebody says "Ooh, sorry about that, I screwed this up because of this," and we say, "Oh, that's fine." they explain to us why they aren't culpable. But the funny thing is, this is, properly speaking, giving an excuse, and I never understood that. I don't want to hear any excuses. Why not? If there's an excuse for what went wrong, that's like the best case possible. What they really mean is they don't want to hear any false excuses, but that's presupposing the falsity of them before they've been heard, which is just stupid. Anyway, point being that we do those things, but this is to some degree why, like, really culpability is between a person and God, because we can't really know what they truly believed or what they truly knew from their own perspective. And that is very subjective in that sense, in that it's not though what the person believes about their culpability that matters. It's what they believed in the moment when they were doing it at the time, not later. And that part is subjective in that sense because it depends upon the individual who is doing the action. This is in no way to be confused with whether the action that they did was good or evil. It's just whether they're culpable for it. There is, by the way, the exact equivalent thing about whether or not whether an action is creditable. That is to say, whether an action is a credit to a person, whether or not they are morally responsible for the good that they did. Because you can do good completely by accident, where you never intended to help anybody, but like you just kind of ended up helping them anyway. That too is a concept, but not very interesting to the moment. People don't get hung up on it, so I don't want to spend time on it. So, those are the pitfalls that people sometimes get tripped up on. But there are a lot of people who just outright deny that there is in fact such a thing as objective morality, that you can be right or wrong as to whether a thing is in fact evil. Now, this would be coherent if... I'm sorry, let me back up one step. So here's the problem that you face if you take that approach. I want to spell it out rather than just assume it. The problem that you face if you take this approach is that since there is no objective moral standard, so a person cannot be right or wrong, when they call something good, they are not saying that it actually has some property in itself. They are not saying, because I mean, if you're really being correct about it, to be good is to have the fullness of being, and to be evil is to have a deprivation or privation of being. That's scholastic terms. It's important to be aware of that, but if that doesn't make sense, don't worry about it. I won't get into the details now. It'll help you if you do, but if you don't worry about it. So the thing here is that if there is nothing... So the objective standard, however, is about particular configurations of reality, that this configuration of reality is good, that configuration of reality is not good. And as such, the objective moral standard is making claims about the nature of reality, so that when you do something, the objective moral claim is that the thing that you actually did has a nature and has a property, and it is therefore arguable. You and someone else can argue over whether or not this thing actually has this property. You can investigate it, you can discuss it, and there is an objective reality outside of you towards which people are supposed to conform, such that when you show somebody what that objective reality is, they then will actually not conform to it if they are good. They can, of course, choose evil to refuse to conform to the good, but if they are good, they will then, of their own free will and without force, conform themselves to the truth which you have helped them to see. This is where persuasion is possible. This is where argument, as distinct from a quarrel, is possible. Like argumentation, like logical argumentation. And so that's where, in objective morality, you can actually have an argument with somebody over whether or not a thing was good or whether a thing was evil, because you are both making claims about the thing. If, however, there is not one standard, there are many standards, and your standard is not the same as somebody else's standard, but is also no more valid than their standard, you are not making a claim about the nature of the thing, because the thing has one nature. And so if you're making a claim about the nature of the thing and somebody else is making a claim about the nature of the thing, at a minimum, one of you is wrong, and possibly one of you is right. That would result in a objective morality. You could find out which of you is right and which of you is wrong. However, that's the very thing that's being denied by the subjective morality. So you can't do that. You can't investigate the thing to find out whether or not it's evil or good. What this does is it means that good and evil are simply statements of your own preference. When you call something good subjectively, where you're not saying that you can be discovered to be correct and somebody else can be discovered to be wrong about this. This is just your tablet of values, to use a slightly Nietzschean term. The tablet of good and evil. It's a reference to the tablets of the law that Moses carried down. That each person has his own tablets on which he writes anything that he wants. All he's doing at most, if he's not being completely random, is stating his own preferences. He's stating what he likes and what he dislikes. And that's it. That's all it is. And so, now, you could be completely consistent with this if you actually... to be consistent, you get rid of the terms good and evil, because they wouldn't mean anything different than saying, I like it, I dislike it. We already have those words. And since good and evil could confuse somebody into thinking that you're making some sort of actual objective claim, you would stop using those terms and limit yourself entirely to the entirely clear terms of I like it or I don't like it. Again, supposing you thought that clear communication was of any value, which I guess would be up to you. So if you don't think that clear communication is of any value, and instead you like confusing people and saying things not to communicate to them, but so that they think you mean something other than what you actually mean, and you think that's good on your tablet of good and evil, then, I guess we'll go to it then. But supposing for a moment that you are not so perverse and think that communication exists so that another person knows what the heck you mean, you would never use the terms good and evil anymore. You would only use terms like I like it and I dislike it. But here's the thing. Telling people what you like and dislike is if you are not answering a question, and if there's not a practical thing here where somebody's offering you, if somebody says, hey, would you like some ice cream, then telling them which flavor you would prefer is an entirely reasonable thing in that circumstance, because they want to know what your preference is. But other than that, most of the time, nobody cares. And telling people, oh, I really like chocolate ice cream. I'm playing chess. Why are you... are you so important that I need to know your love for chocolate ice cream while I'm busy not doing anything that has anything to do with that? That's the problem that all morality becomes exactly that. Because you're not making... In this theory, you're not making any claims about the actual things in themselves. You're only making claims about your reactions to these things. So talking about your reactions to these things is talking about you. You are being, in a strict sense, narcissistic. The only thing that you talk about here is you. And so it makes all communication in a proper sense impossible. I suppose that one of the things you've written on your tablet of good and evil is everyone should care what I like and dislike. In which case, well, I guess you're being consistent in being a narcissist. I shall be a narcissist, being law number one, I suppose. But yeah, you have the complete breakdown of all possible communication, other than the utterly narcissistic, making sure everybody knows what you like and dislike. But where this comes, sort of my motivating example here, and where this comes up a lot, and where I think it will be helpful to a lot of other people too, is that you will see people who will tell you that objective morality is nonsense and espouse subjective morality, who will then go on to try to say that whatever, whether it's something in the Bible or something that the church did or some particular person or one of your friends online or whatever it is, that they're a bad person. They did this terrible thing. It's well, that's not an argument. You're literally just telling me that you don't like them. By what you just said, all you are doing is telling me right now about yourself. You cannot possibly convict somebody else on the grounds of telling me stuff about you. And so this is where subjective morality becomes completely incoherent, because nobody who espouses subjective morality actually sticks to this. Nobody tells you, he murdered somebody, that makes him bad, actually means that the person speaking happens to dislike it, and that we're for some reason supposed to be interested in the fact that he dislikes this thing that happened. So this is the utter incoherence of it, that you see people who theoretically espouse subjective morality, who are entirely basing or who will entirely base their arguments on objective morality, even though they may have literally told you a few minutes ago there is no such thing as objective morality. But the moment they are trying to claim that any of their moral arguments are arguments about a thing rather than about themselves, they are actually talking about objective morality, because they are claiming something about a nature outside of themselves to which they can be right or, and the moment they're doing that, they can either be right or wrong. There becomes another problem with now, the reason why they so often talk about subjective morality, by the way, and this is sort of another problem with their appeals to an objective morality, is they intrinsically can't believe in this objective morality, because for there to be an objective morality, for there to be something like thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not lie, you have to have a consistent human nature. For these rules to all apply, there has to be a shared human nature between all of these people, such that they all have the nature that they shouldn't tell lies, they all have the nature that they shouldn't steal, etc. And so, you have a really, really, really big problem in specifically the modern Western context when you hold that evolution is undirected, and you hold that there is no idea, there is no actual normative human nature to which evolution has been brought in order to create this human nature, such that all people actually are examples of it. You run into problems that the only people who have the same DNA are identical twins, and you thus have the problem that, the same is true of epigenetics. I just want to point out that it's not just genetics, it's also epigenetics that helps to determine what a person is, because it's not just the DNA, but the cell chooses to express parts of the DNA. And so what the human being does, becomes, etc., is always based not just on the genetics, but also the epigenetics. Because remember, there's like an entire working functional cell that you start out from, donated by your mother. Your father only gives you your half of your genetics, assuming you're not parthenogenically born, but in humans that is rare. So assuming you're not parthenogenically born, you will have half of your DNA from your mother, half of your DNA from your father, but you get the entire first cell that all of your cells are based on from your mother, and cells influence what gets expressed in the genetics, and so there's a complex interplay. However, you're not going to start with the same cell and not be identical twins. So it still holds. I just want to point out that it's more complicated. Sorry, I'm not good at simplifying. Anyway, so the point being here that you have all of these people with different genetics and epigenetics, with the exception of identical twins. And so are these people the same thing? Well, since there is no normative human nature that these people are part of, but rather they're defined entirely by their genetics and epigenetics, and environment, I guess, too, actually. Because the environment does play a role in how the organism behaves and expresses itself and develops, etc. Just feed them really well and they get bigger, feed them smaller and they stunt and then stay that size, etc. All right, point being, all these factors, not the same. So what makes two human beings the same thing, such that the same rules apply to them? How do you know that one human being is not from a different strain, has not, perhaps he's the very first of his line of people with a genetic mutation where they should lie? You can't. There's no way of doing it. People yell and scream and argue because they don't like the conclusion, but they won't say anything of any substance here, unfortunately. And, if there's a counter-argument, propose it, but it's the best you can do is some sort of statistical argument that can't be based on experimentation. That's the other, by the way, problem. Occasionally, I think I actually have a video about how you can't have a scientific morality. It was in a, if my memory is serving me, it was in a response to Computing Forever, back when he was an atheist, and talked about having a scientific morality or something. And I forget if it was its own video on scientific morality or if it was just part of the response to that. But either way, you can't have a scientific morality for the simple reason that how on earth are you going to set up controlled experiments in order to determine the morality? So you want to find out if rape is good or evil, right? we're not presupposing this. It's a scientific morality. We test everything, correct? So what experiment are you going to set up? You divide the group in half, and you rape this group and you don't rape that group, and what are you going to measure at that point? Because there's a recursive problem. So like, how are you going to figure out what even is good? You can just punt the question, say like, we're just arbitrarily going to define happiness or this much dopamine or whatever the hell it is as like the outcome of good. And so if we find that, we'll call it good. But what experiment, how are you going to scientifically verify that that was actually something valuable? How do you experimentally determine that what you're measuring for good is in fact actually measuring good? So yeah, there's a recursion problem because you can never actually experimentally get started. There is no uniform, you can say what mass is, you can say what force is, sort of, but you can at least say like, okay, this thing here that this produces is force, so we're going to compare forces to this thing, and that's what measurement basically is, because measurement is always like length versus the length of a thing you're measuring by. So length is an intrinsically comparative, or measurement is an intrinsically comparative thing. You've got a problem though, because there's no obvious universally agreed upon like what universally agreed upon physical thing that you can measure things against of this is good or this is evil. And so you sure as hell can't tell that something's good or evil by using like a scale or a photometer or something that would measure temperature, volume, etc. Anyway, so you can never get a scientific morality started, but even supposing you could, who exactly is going to propose the experiment where we find out whether is rape good or rape evil? Like, is rape really evil, or is that just an old wives' tale that rape is evil? Well, remember, the whole idea of science is we test everything, right? So we'll divide two groups in half, we'll rape one half, not rape the other half, and then we'll put them on our goodometer and figure out whether or not they're better or worse. And then we will conclude from this, that rape is evil, depending upon what the outcome of our goodometer is. The thing is absurd. The thing is truly absurd. You couldn't possibly set up this experiment, so you can't do it. Now, as I said, this is punting the question of the goodometer. You can't have a goodometer, so you can't actually apply the scientific method, because without the ability to measure, you can't do science. So, yeah, it's this idea that we can have a scientific morality, and that this will sort of get us around the subjective problem, because if you can do it scientifically, everyone will then agree upon it once you show them the scientific evidence. And so, yeah, even though it's even though it's still subjective, we'd have a consensus, which is sort of close enough for functioning, I guess. It straight up won't work. It can't work. Nothing like it could even begin to work. So you're stuck intrinsically in this and even so, like, because that human beings are changing. With every generation, human beings are changing. So you'd have to be reconducting these experiments. And what if there's just a new strain of person where you get different goodometer readings on the basis of what happens to them? How would you know? You know that they're changing. You know that there is mutations that are going on where people are becoming different. People become taller, shorter, lighter, darker, whatever. This happens. We know that. We know that there is change. That's one thing we are really, really quite sure of. The whole purpose of, the nature of sexual reproduction is such that the genetics get swapped around, and you get different genetics in a different epigenetic environment. For like at least half the genetics that are in the new organism are in a different epigenetic environment than they originally came from. So, that's to say the fathers are in a different epigenetic environment. So, the whole thing, you have no way of saying that there is actually, like, human beings, plural, with a consistent human nature that is not changing, such that all of your tablet of good and evils, if it's not purely a projection of your will, because, you can project your will into anything you want, but if you were to try to do anything like that scientific approach, you still couldn't do it, because your past results may well not apply anymore. What is the, best mix of dog food or whatever changes. You breed the dogs for different things. You put them in a different environment. A few generations of taking dogs who had been used to sit on couches and breeding them in the direction of being good for running, and your ideal food mix is actually going to wind up to be different because, fun fact, greyhounds need to be fed an awful lot of fat because they do so much work. Same thing with some of the breeds that just like run all day long. They need tons of energy, but the breeds who just lay down on a couch don't. And in fact, you want to feed them very low, relatively high protein, low calorie food. The dogs who, like lap dogs who just are tired all day and just sit around all day and don't go running around very much. Now, there are lap dogs that do run too. Again, big and complicated mess. Point being that that things change means that you can't apply past results for very long. So you are just in this utter complete morass of the inability to do anything like this. And so it's the whole thing, the entire project of having anything like a subjective morality is one that people don't hold to, but unfortunately they have to hold to if they're not going to essentially in the modern Western version of atheism, you have to hold to subjective morality, and it is completely nonsensical. But that is also why within postmodernism all that exists is the will and the imposition of the will on other wills, because, well, I mean, that's all that you have. If God is dead, there is nothing left but will, and there's the struggle of all against all, which is the only thing that exists. Or to quote Sartre, hell is other people. So this is the incoherence of the thing. This is the necessary incoherence of the thing. It's why it has to be the way it is, and the thing makes no sense and becomes just this imposition of will. And it's also why, if you look at the people who espouse it, why are they so incoherent? Well, have to be. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.